In the winter of 1867, from deep in Utah's Wasatch Mountains, construction foreman Samuel Hartwell sent his final telegraph from the Union Pacific's Camp 17. Only 7 words made up the message. Critical supply shortages. Men eating each other. When the rescue expedition finally reached the isolated work camp 3 days later, through 12 feet of snow, they found the cook fires still burning. From massive iron cauldrons filled with what appeared to be stew, steam was rising. But of the 127 workers stationed there, only 18 remained alive. Huddled in the supply shed they were discovered, their eyes wild with terror, refusing to speak about what had sustained them through the brutal mountain winter. All records of Camp 17 were immediately sealed by the railroad company, and for over a century, families of the missing workers were told their loved ones had simply wandered off into the wilderness. But a horror so systematic, so carefully orchestrated, is revealed by recently discovered company correspondence that it challenges everything we thought we knew about America's westward expansion. Before we continue with the story of Camp 17 and the men who disappeared into those boiling cauldrons, I want you to take a moment to hit that notification bell and subscribe to our channel. In American railroad history, one of the most disturbing episodes we're about to uncover. And in the comments below, I'd love to know which state you're listening from. Buried beneath layers of corporate secrecy and government denial for generations would remain the truth about what happened in those Utah mountains during the winter of 1867. But a picture of calculated brutality is painted by the evidence we've uncovered that makes the Donner Party look like a Sunday picnic. Everything ambitious and ruthless about America's race to complete the Transcontinental Railroad was represented by Camp 17. Along a treacherous stretch of track through Utah's Wasatch Range, the camp was established in September 1867, housing 127 men tasked with laying rails across terrain that had claimed countless lives before them and blasting through solid granite. Driven by the promise of $48,000 per mile of track laid through mountainous terrain, nearly 3 times the compensation for plains construction, the Union Pacific Railroad, locked in fierce competition with the Central Pacific to claim the most lucrative government subsidies, had pushed construction deeper into the mountains than any sensible engineer would recommend. A testament to industrial determination and human desperation was the camp itself. Dotted along a narrow valley between towering peaks that rose over 8,000 feet above sea level were canvas tents and hastily constructed wooden barracks, while the constant thunder of dynamite echoed off canyon walls as work crews blasted their way through ancient stone formations that had stood unchanged since before human memory. For its strategic position along the surveyed route, the site had been chosen, not for its habitability, forcing the workers to carve their living space from a landscape that seemed actively hostile to human presence. Most of the workers were Irish immigrants fleeing the lingering effects of the Great Famine, joined by discharged Civil War veterans who carried the psychological scars of battles like Gettysburg and Antietam, and freed slaves seeking opportunity in the expanding West where the color of a man's skin mattered less than his willingness to risk his life for railroad wages. They worked for $2.50 a day when wages were paid, which became increasingly rare as the railroad company diverted funds to stockholders rather than supporting remote work crews. In a mixture of languages and dialects the diverse crew spoke, creating a babel of voices that somehow managed to coordinate the dangerous work of mountain railroad construction. Samuel Hartwell was leading this desperate band of laborers, a former Union Army quartermaster whose organizational skills had impressed railroad executives in Omaha during a brief meeting where he'd outlined his theories on managing large crews under adverse conditions. At 43, Hartwell carried the bearing of a military man with steel-gray hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to catalog every detail around him, from the daily tonnage of rock moved to the subtle signs of discontent among his workers. That successful leadership required maintaining authority through a combination of respect and fear was what his military experience had taught him, a lesson that would prove tragically relevant during the coming winter. His assistant foreman Thomas Quinlan worked beside him, a Dubliner giant who stood nearly 6.5 feet tall and could swing a 20-pound sledgehammer for 12 hours straight while still having energy to break up fights in the evening. Through a combination of raw physical strength and an intuitive understanding of worker psychology that allowed him to diffuse tensions before they erupted into violence, Quinlan had earned his position. His massive hands, scarred from years of manual labor, could be gentle enough to bandage a minor injury or brutal enough to discipline a troublemaker, depending on the situation's requirements. The camp's cook, Wilhelm Brenner, had followed the pattern of German immigration west from Pennsylvania, bringing with him an impressive knowledge of preserving meat and stretching meager provisions to feed large crews during his service with a Pennsylvania regiment that had spent months under siege conditions during the war. An intensity that some workers found unsettling was held by Brenner's pale blue eyes, and his habit of studying each man's physical condition with the calculating gaze of a butcher evaluating livestock had been noticed, but dismissed as professional thoroughness. With military precision his cook tent was organized, every knife sharp enough to shave with, and every pot scrubbed to a gleaming finish that reflected his obsessive attention to cleanliness and efficiency. By October 1867, like cracks in a dam that would eventually burst with catastrophic force, signs of trouble were already emerging. Supply trains that should have arrived weekly began arriving sporadically, sometimes 2 or 3 weeks apart, carrying partial loads that seemed to have been picked over before reaching Camp 17. Facing financial pressure from investors concerned about cost overruns and government oversight of their subsidy claims, the railroad company had quietly begun diverting supply shipments to camps closer to civilization, leaving remote outposts like Camp 17 to fend for themselves with whatever scraps remained after more accessible crews had been supplied. When confronted by telegraph about the supply shortages, company executives in Omaha sent back terse responses about temporary logistics adjustments and assured camp leadership that full provisions would resume shortly pending resolution of transportation difficulties. An undertone of barely concealed irritation was carried by the responses, as if the mountain workers were being unreasonably demanding by expecting regular food deliveries during a harsh Utah winter. By hunting the few deer and elk that remained in the area, the men began supplementing their dwindling rations. But game had been largely driven away by months of constant blasting and construction noise that echoed through the valleys like continuous thunder. The local wildlife had either fled to quieter regions or been killed off by previous hunting expeditions, leaving the surrounding mountains as barren of animal life as they were of human habitation. By November, the standard daily ration had been reduced from 3 meals to 2, then to 1 meal, plus whatever the men could forage from the increasingly barren landscape that offered little beyond pine needles and bitter mountain herbs. Like a constant grinding pain that made every small irritation feel like a major insult, hunger gnawed at the crew as tempers flared. Over card games and perceived slights fights broke out that would have been laughed off under normal circumstances, with men who had previously worked together harmoniously suddenly viewing each other as competitors for scarce resources. Tense affairs where workers eyed each other's portions and counted every bite with the calculating attention of accountants tracking valuable assets became the evening gatherings around the cook fires, once filled with songs and stories from the old country. Yet, even as conditions deteriorated with each passing day, the pressure from company headquarters to maintain construction schedules never let up. Arriving in daily telegrams that demanded progress reports and threatened wage cuts or replacement by other crews if productivity declined, daily quotas for track laying and rock removal remained unchanged despite the reduced workforce efficiency caused by malnutrition and the increasing difficulty of working in sub-freezing temperatures that made metal tools painful to handle and turned exhaled breath into clouds of ice crystals that obscured vision. The advancing winter that grew more brutal with each passing week, diminishing food supplies that seemed to shrink regardless of careful rationing, and corporate masters who seemed utterly disconnected from the reality of mountain construction work, between these things the men found themselves trapped. Like messages from another planet, the company's demands felt, written by men who had never felt the bite of mountain wind or the exhaustion of swinging a pickaxe at granite while fighting altitude sickness and chronic hunger. On November 23, 1867, during what should have been a routine blasting operation in the granite face that had been resisting their efforts for nearly 2 weeks, the first death came. Patrick Sullivan, a 24-year-old from County Cork, whose cheerful disposition had made him popular among the Irish workers, was positioning charges in a crevice when a premature explosion brought down several tons of rock in a thunderous cascade that shook the entire valley. Either a defective fuse or contaminated powder was suggested by the blast that occurred without warning, though the exact cause would never be determined due to the destruction of physical evidence. For nearly an hour, Sullivan's screams echoed through the mountain air, growing progressively weaker as shock and blood loss took their toll. But when the crew finally managed to clear enough debris to reach him, they found his body crushed beyond recognition. By the immense weight of falling granite, every bone had been shattered into a gruesome paste that stained the rocks around him with dark patches that would remain visible for weeks were his organs pulverized. Once animated by an infectious smile that could lighten the mood of the entire crew, his face was now unrecognizable, transformed into something that barely resembled human features. For the rest of their lives, what happened next would haunt the survivors, though few would ever speak of it publicly or even acknowledge their memories in private conversations. As the men stood around Sullivan's mangled remains in stunned silence, discussing the grim practicalities of burial in ground that had been frozen solid for weeks, Cook Wilhelm Brenner stepped forward with an expression that several witnesses later described as curious rather than horrified. With the same professional attention he usually reserved for examining sides of beef delivered by the supply trains, his pale eyes studied the wreckage. His weathered hands moving with surprising gentleness as he examined the extent of the damage and calculated what portions might still be salvageable despite the traumatic injuries, Brenner knelt beside the body. With the methodical precision of a man who had spent years evaluating meat quality under various conditions, from battlefield casualties to livestock slaughtered under less than ideal circumstances, his assessment was conducted. "There's still good meat here," Brenner announced in his thick German accent, his words cutting through the mountain air like a knife blade through silence. "Waste not, want not. That's what we learned during the siege of Vicksburg when we had to make every scrap count." As Brenner began efficiently separating usable flesh from the damaged areas, his butcher's knife moving with practiced precision that spoke of years spent processing various types of meat under pressure, the assembled workers stared in stunned silence. "This boy gave his life for the railroad," Brenner continued matter-of-factly, never pausing in his grisly examination. "The least we can do is not let him feed the wolves and bears that prowl these mountains looking for easy meals." Only the practical tone of a professional solving a logistical problem with the tools and resources available was carried by his voice, no trace of madness or desperation. Thomas Quinlan was the first to voice what everyone was thinking, his massive frame trembling slightly as he struggled to process what he was witnessing. "Jesus Christ, Wilhelm, you can't be serious about this madness." But no trace of insanity or moral confusion was held by Brenner's pale blue eyes, only the calculating look of a man solving a practical problem with the efficiency that had made him valuable to the railroad company. "I've served horse meat to cavalry units, rat stew to siege survivors, and boiled leather to men who would have died otherwise," Brenner replied, never pausing in his systematic work. "This is fresher than anything we've had in weeks, and Patrick here was a healthy young man who took good care of himself." An almost pedagogical tone was carried by the cook's voice, as if he were explaining basic principles of nutrition and resource management to students who had failed to grasp obvious concepts. The most crucial decision of his life was faced by Foreman Samuel Hartwell, one that would define not only his own fate but the destiny of every man under his command. As foreman, he possessed the authority to put a stop to Brenner's proposal immediately. But he was also acutely aware that their last supply train was now 3 weeks overdue, that their remaining provisions would last perhaps another 10 days if carefully rationed, and that the weather reports from passing telegraph operators suggested the mountain passes would remain impassable until April at the earliest. To their fate, the railroad company had effectively abandoned them. Like a giant fist closing around their isolated camp, winter was tightening its grip on the mountains, and 126 men were looking to him for leadership that might keep them alive until spring brought relief. Standing over Sullivan's broken body while his starving crew waited for a decision that would either preserve their humanity or ensure their survival, the weight of command had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. For what felt like hours the silence stretched as the men waited for Hartwell's decision, their breath forming clouds of vapor in the frigid air while snow began falling in large soft flakes that would soon cover Sullivan's bloodstained corpse. Finally, Hartwell gave a barely perceptible nod, and with renewed efficiency and what might have been the faintest hint of satisfaction in his pale eyes, Brenner resumed his work. Within 2 hours, mixed with their dwindling supply of potatoes and onions to mask both the texture and taste of what they were consuming, portions of Patrick Sullivan had joined the evening stew. To disguise the meat's origin, Brenner had worked with remarkable skill, seasoning it heavily with wild herbs he claimed to have found near the partially frozen stream and cutting it into small pieces that could be mistaken for game meat by men hungry enough to avoid asking uncomfortable questions. Standing around the cook fires with their bowls untouched while they wrestled with moral objections that seemed increasingly abstract compared to the immediate reality of their empty stomachs, most of the men claimed they couldn't bring themselves to eat the stew. but by morning, every bowl had been scraped clean, and several workers quietly asked Brenner if there might be more of the same mountain game available for future meals. That night, several workers reported hearing sounds from the cook tent that would become horribly familiar over the coming weeks. The rhythmic thunk of cleaver against cutting board, the scrape of knife against bone, and Brenner's voice humming old German folk songs as he worked through the night processing what remained of their former companion. Until nearly dawn the sounds continued, accompanied by the crackling of fires and the occasional splash of water as Brenner cleaned his tools and work surfaces with the same meticulous attention to hygiene that had characterized his cooking throughout the construction season. When the men emerged for breakfast the next morning, they found their usual porridge supplemented with what Brenner called mountain sausage, densely packed links with a texture none of them recognized, but a taste that satisfied their growing hunger more completely than anything they'd eaten in weeks. So skillfully had the sausage been seasoned and spiced that it bore no resemblance to its grim source, and several workers complimented the cook on his ability to create such satisfying fare from their limited resources. Almost imperceptibly, the transformation of Camp 17 began gradually, like a slow poison working its way through the collective soul of the work crew until it had infected every aspect of their daily existence. Within days of Sullivan's death, the men noticed that their energy levels had improved dramatically despite the harsh conditions that should have been sapping their strength. A sense of satisfaction and physical vigor that none of them had felt since early autumn when supplies were still arriving regularly had replaced the constant gnawing hunger that had plagued them for weeks. Meanwhile, an almost mystical authority within the camp hierarchy that extended far beyond his official role as cook had been taken on by Wilhelm Brenner. Now seeking his approval and advice on matters ranging from work assignments to personal disputes were men who had previously dismissed him as just another immigrant tradesman, treating his opinions with the deference typically reserved for religious leaders or military commanders. With a new confidence that bordered on arrogance, he moved through the camp, his pale eyes studying each worker with the same calculating assessment he had once reserved for cuts of meat delivered by the supply trains. When asked about his seemingly endless ability to stretch their provisions and maintain the crew's improved nutrition despite the ongoing supply crisis, Brenner would simply smile and tap his temple with one weathered finger. "Waste not, want not," he would repeat like a mantra. "There's always more where you'd least expect it if you know how to look and aren't squeamish about taking advantage of opportunities when they present themselves." On December 7th, when veteran railroad worker Marcus Holloway suffered what appeared to be a massive heart attack while hauling timber from the cutting area to the construction site, the second death occurred. Unlike Sullivan's gruesome demise under tons of granite, Holloway's death was clean and peaceful. The 40-year-old Ohio native simply dropped his load mid-step, clutched his chest with both hands, and collapsed to the frozen ground where he died within minutes, despite the efforts of Dr. Edwin Cartwright to revive him. A steady, reliable worker whose experience with railroad construction dated back to the early expansion projects in the Midwest had been Holloway, making his sudden death a genuine shock to his fellow workers who had come to depend on his knowledge and leadership in technical matters. Not just another mouth to feed, but the elimination of valuable expertise that would be difficult to replace in their isolated circumstances was represented by his loss. But this time there was no debate about what to do with the body, no shocked silence or moral wrestling with unthinkable options. Before anyone could suggest alternatives like burial or preservation until spring, Brenner was already sharpening his knives with the methodical care of a craftsman preparing for important work. So routine had the cook's response become that several workers began helping him transport the body to his processing area without being asked, as if they were simply following established protocol for handling workplace fatalities. Marcus was a good worker who understood the value of efficiency, Brenner announced as he began his familiar routine, his hands moving with increased skill and speed that spoke of recent practice. He'd want to keep helping the crew even now, contributing to our survival in the only way that's still possible for him. With a mixture of horror and fascination the men watched as Brenner worked, noting his increasing expertise in the grim art of human butchery and the almost artistic precision with which he separated useful meat from less desirable portions. Barely 1 hour with Holloway's intact body was required for what had taken him hours with Sullivan's mangled corpse, and noticeably superior in both quantity and quality were the results. Techniques for maximizing the yield from each victim had been developed by Brenner, utilizing organs and portions that might have been discarded during his earlier, less experienced efforts. In every aspect of the process, from the efficiency of his cutting to the creative ways he disguised the final product, his growing expertise was evident. More disturbing than Brenner's technical improvement was the crew's growing acceptance of their new dietary reality, which had evolved from desperate necessity to something approaching enthusiasm. When the evening stew was served, seasoned with wild herbs that Brenner claimed to have found near the frozen stream, but which some suspected he was cultivating in secret locations around the camp, the men ate with genuine appetite rather than the forced necessity they had felt before. Some workers even complimented the cook on the improved flavor and texture of their enhanced rations, praising his ability to make their special provisions taste better with each preparation and asking if he might be able to obtain more of the same high-quality ingredients. To the point where they could discuss cannibalism in the euphemistic language of restaurant patrons evaluating a particularly successful meal. The psychological distance between their former lives and their current reality had widened. But patterns that troubled him deeply were beginning to be noticed by foreman Samuel Hartwell, even as he recognized his own complicity in establishing the system that made those patterns possible. With suspicious regularity were occurring the deaths, which had initially seemed like unfortunate accidents typical of dangerous railroad construction work, roughly every 10 to 12 days, just as their enhanced rations were beginning to run low and the men started showing signs of renewed hunger and decreased energy. More disturbing still was the subtle change in how the men interacted with each other during work hours and evening gatherings. Conversations had become guarded and calculating, with workers eyeing their companions not as fellow laborers sharing common hardships, but as potential threats to their own survival or potential resources for addressing future food shortages. A constant state of wariness that made every interaction feel like a negotiation had replaced the easy camaraderie that had once characterized the crew's relationships. The third death, that of Irish immigrant Seamus O'Brien on December 19, removed any lingering doubts about the trajectory their isolated community was following and marked the point where accident gave way to deliberate action. A typically robust 28-year-old who had never shown signs of illness or weakness, O'Brien allegedly slipped on ice while carrying blasting powder from the storage area to the worksite and struck his head on a granite outcropping with enough force to cause fatal injuries. Severe, but not immediately fatal, was the injury. Yet when his fellow workers found him 20 minutes later, O'Brien was dead, his skull crushed by what appeared to be repeated blows from a heavy instrument rather than a single impact from falling. A story that contradicted the official explanation was told by the blood spatter pattern and the condition of the alleged ice patch, but no one seemed interested in conducting a thorough investigation. With the thoroughness his position required, Thomas Quinlan investigating the scene discovered that the ice patch where O'Brien supposedly slipped showed no signs of disturbance that would be consistent with a fall, and that the blood spatter pattern suggested the fatal injuries had occurred while the victim was lying on the ground rather than standing upright. Clearly toward deliberate murder pointed the evidence. But when Quinlan brought these observations to Hartwell, telling in its brevity and finality was the foreman's response. To keep his suspicions to himself and help Brenner prepare the evening meal was what Hartwell ordered Quinlan, making it clear that official investigations into workplace accidents were less important than maintaining crew morale and ensuring adequate nutrition during the difficult winter months. The point where leadership shifted from maintaining order to actively participating in systematic murder was marked by the foreman's decision. That night, as the men gathered around their cook fires with unusual enthusiasm and anticipation, a horrible realization began crystallizing in the minds of the few who still retained enough moral clarity to see what was happening to their community. They were no longer survivors adapting to desperate circumstances with regrettable but necessary compromises. They had become participants in systematic murder, with each death carefully timed to maintain their food supply through the long mountain winter that stretched ahead like an eternity of hunger and cold. A laboratory for human degradation that would have horrified even the most hardened observers of frontier brutality was created by the isolation of Camp 17 during the winter of 1867-68, transforming ordinary working men into something that challenged the basic assumptions of civilized society. As December faded into January with no sign of rescue or resupply, the remaining 124 workers had settled into a routine that combined back-breaking labor with carefully orchestrated death, all overseen by the increasingly powerful trio of Hartwell, Quinlan, and Brenner, who had assumed roles that went far beyond their official positions. Almost ritualistic in its precision and deliberate cruelty had become the selection process. Every 10 days, Brenner would appear at the morning meal with what he called his nutrition assessment, a clipboard and pencil in hand as he carefully studied each worker's physical condition, productivity levels, and most chillingly, their social connections within the group. Assigned to the most dangerous tasks with an efficiency that suggested careful planning rather than random chance, found themselves workers who kept to themselves, who had no close friends among the crew, or who showed signs of weakness or illness. Seemingly reasonable on the surface were the assignments: handling unstable explosives that required steady hands and clear thinking, working alone in unstable tunnel sections where cave-ins were common, or maintaining equipment near the treacherous cliff edges where a single misstep could result in a fatal fall. But to anyone who paid attention, unmistakable was the pattern. Invariably those who would be least missed by their fellow workers and whose deaths would cause the minimum disruption to camp morale were the men selected for these dangerous duties. So insidiously effective was what made the system its veneer of practical necessity and professional competence. When 23-year-old German immigrant Friedrich Kohler was found dead at the bottom of a ravine on January 2, allegedly having fallen while checking survey markers in an area known for unstable footing, his death was treated as another tragic accident in an inherently dangerous profession. Within the camp, due to language barriers and cultural differences, had Kohler been isolated, making him an ideal candidate for elimination according to Brenner's utilitarian calculus. So routine had Brenner's immediate response to each death become that none of the workers even questioned it anymore, accepting his presence at accident scenes as natural as a doctor responding to medical emergencies. With an efficiency that suggested extensive experience, the cook would arrive with his specialized tools and begin his grisly work, processing each victim with techniques that had been refined through practice and experimentation. Perhaps more disturbing than the physical acts of cannibalism was the psychological transformation of the camp, representing a complete breakdown of the social bonds that had held the crew together during the early months of construction. Now speaking only of work schedules and equipment maintenance with the mechanical precision of factory workers rather than human beings, were men who had once shared stories of their families back home, trading photographs and letters from loved ones during evening gatherings. Silent affairs where workers consumed their enhanced rations with the mechanical efficiency of animals feeding at a trough had become the evening gatherings around the cook fires, once filled with songs and jokes that helped maintain morale during difficult times. A constant state of wariness had replaced trust, with each man calculating his own value to the group and assessing potential threats from his companions while trying to avoid behaviors that might mark him for elimination. With an enthusiasm that surprised even Samuel Hartwell, who had initially viewed the Dublin giant as a useful subordinate rather than a true partner in their enterprise, Thomas Quinlan had embraced his role as chief enforcer. Genuine pleasure in the selection process seemed to be taken by Quinlan, approaching potential victims with the same methodical patience he had once applied to railroad construction tasks, studying their habits and weaknesses with the focused attention of a predator choosing prey. When young Irish immigrant Daniel McCarthy began showing signs of exhaustion and malnutrition in mid-January, displaying the hollow-eyed look and trembling hands that marked him as a liability to the crew's productivity, Quinlan appointed himself McCarthy's constant companion and helper. Assistance with heavy lifting and seemingly genuine friendship during a time when social isolation could be fatal were offered by the assistant foreman, creating a false sense of security that made the eventual betrayal more effective. 3 days later, McCarthy was found crushed beneath a load of timber that had allegedly shifted during transport from the cutting area to the construction site, with Quinlan conveniently present to witness the accident and help extract the body from beneath the heavy logs. Just as the camp's enhanced food supplies were running low and the men were beginning to show signs of renewed hunger and decreased energy, perfect was the timing. What he suspected were deliberate killings had initially been attempted to be documented by the camp's medical officer, Dr. Edwin Cartwright, maintaining detailed notes about the circumstances surrounding each death and the inconsistencies in the official explanations. To observe evidence objectively and draw logical conclusions from physical facts had his medical training taught him, making him potentially dangerous to the system that Hartwell and his associates had established. But by late January, even Cartwright had succumbed to the prevailing madness that had infected every aspect of camp life, his medical oath overwhelmed by the brutal pragmatism of survival and the psychological pressure of prolonged isolation. When he examined the body of railroad worker Giuseppe Delacorte on January 24, another alleged accident victim whose injuries were inconsistent with the described circumstances, Cartwright simply noted death by misadventure in his log and helped Brenner transport the corpse to the cook tent without conducting the thorough investigation that his training demanded. The most chilling aspect of Camp 17's transformation was how completely normal the systematic murder and cannibalism had begun to feel to the surviving workers, who had adapted to their new reality with a psychological flexibility that would have been impossible to imagine under normal circumstances. Now eagerly anticipating meal times, gathering around the cook fires with genuine enthusiasm while praising Brenner's culinary innovations and even making specific requests for particular preparations were men who had once been horrified by the prospect of consuming human flesh. An extensive repertoire of techniques for disguising the taste and texture of human meat had been developed by the cook, incorporating wild seasonings and creative combinations that made their grim rations not just palatable but genuinely appetizing to men whose moral compass had been completely destroyed by hunger and desperation. A source of pride within the camp had become Brenner's creativity in the kitchen, with workers competing to offer compliments and suggestions for future meals, as if they were guests at a fine restaurant rather than participants in systematic cannibalism. In early February, when Polish immigrant Kazimierz Kowalski made a discovery that would ultimately provide the most comprehensive record of the winter's atrocities, appeared the first crack in the carefully constructed facade of Camp 17's cannibalistic society. Both the education and moral clarity necessary to document what was happening around him with scientific precision were possessed by Kowalski, a former university student who had immigrated to America following political troubles in his homeland. While searching for usable materials in the abandoned equipment shed, Kowalski discovered a cache of personal belongings that told the true story of the camp's diminishing population. Beneath loose floorboards were hidden watches, wedding rings, family photographs, and personal letters from dozens of workers who had allegedly wandered off or died in accidents, creating a grim museum of the dead that contradicted every official explanation for their disappearances. Detailed notes in Brenner's handwriting that catalogued each victim's physical characteristics, estimated meat yield, and preparation methods with the clinical precision of a scientific study were among the most damning evidence. Experiments in human butchery had been conducted by the cook, refining his techniques and keeping careful records of which approaches produced the best results in terms of both quantity and palatability. His own secret record of events began to be maintained by Kowalski, writing in a mixture of Polish and English to avoid detection while documenting the systematic nature of the murders and the psychological transformation of his fellow workers. Chilling insights into the daily life of a community that had abandoned every principle of civilized behavior in favor of carefully organized survival cannibalism are provided by his diary entries. February 8th. They took Michelson today, Kowalski wrote in one entry. The poor Swedish boy never had a chance once Quinlan marked him for selection. Found him this morning with his skull crushed. Same as the others. Brenner was already sharpening his knives before the body was cold. We'll eat well tonight, and tomorrow the cycle begins again with someone else marked for death. The true scope of the conspiracy that had taken control of Camp 17 began to be revealed by the discovery of additional evidence. Hidden among Hartwell's papers, Kowalski found correspondence with railroad company officials that suggested the foreman had been reporting false information about the camp's population and condition, claiming that missing workers had deserted rather than died, thus avoiding any corporate responsibility for their fate. More disturbing still were indications that the systematic cannibalism had been planned rather than arising spontaneously from desperate circumstances. References to alternative food sources and creative resource management in early correspondence suggested that company officials were aware of what was happening and had chosen to ignore it rather than risk the expense and negative publicity of a rescue operation. By February 1868, an atmosphere of such pervasive terror had been created by the systematic nature of the killings that the remaining 87 workers had effectively segregated themselves into two distinct groups, the inner circle of Hartwell, Quinlan, Brenner, and their most trusted allies, who openly discussed their feeding schedule and victim selection criteria, and the increasingly desperate outer circle of workers who understood exactly what was happening but felt powerless to stop it or escape from their mountain prison. Elaborate justifications for their actions that went far beyond simple survival had been developed by the inner circle, creating a pseudo-intellectual framework that transformed murder and cannibalism into acts of rational resource management. During evening meetings in Hartwell's quarters, they spoke of their work in terms of natural selection and social Darwinism, arguing that they were creating a superior workforce by eliminating the weak and inefficient members of their community. Pseudo-intellectual backing for their cannibalistic practices was provided by Brenner, whose education had included some exposure to scientific theories popular in European universities, with lectures on nutrition and human physiology that claimed consuming the flesh of fellow humans provided superior protein and even psychological benefits. "We're becoming something stronger than ordinary men," Brenner explained to his increasingly devoted followers during one particularly chilling gathering in early February. "Each man we process makes us more resilient, more capable of surviving conditions that would destroy workers who cling to outdated moral restrictions." Detailed records of their meals that went far beyond simple documentation had begun to be kept by the group, noting which victims had provided the most satisfactory nutrition, which preparation methods yielded the best results, and even recording the psychological effects of consuming different types of human flesh. Experiments with preservation techniques borrowed from his military experience had even been begun by Brenner, smoking and salting human flesh to create supplies that could last longer between kills and provide variety in their diet. Meanwhile, in constant terror of being selected for the next accident lived the outer circle, knowing that any sign of weakness or social isolation could mark them for death. In shifts with trusted companions keeping watch through the night while others rested began sleeping workers, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and sleeplessness that further weakened their physical and mental resistance to the horror surrounding them. Alliances for mutual protection were attempted to be formed by some. But consistently undermined were these efforts by the harsh reality that any group large enough to resist the inner circle would also be large enough to threaten the food supply that was keeping everyone alive through the mountain winter. An impossible situation where cooperation meant starvation and resistance meant immediate death had been created by the mathematics of survival. On February 14, when Irish worker Brian Donnelly attempted to organize an armed resistance against what he called the murdering bastards who've turned us into monsters worse than any wild animal, came the breaking point. 12 other workers to join his rebellion had been managed to be convinced by Donnelly, appealing to their remaining humanity and their memories of the moral men they had once been before hunger and desperation had transformed them into something unrecognizable. Weapons and supplies for a confrontation with Hartwell's group had begun to be stockpiled by the rebels, planning to overthrow the cannibalistic leadership and either attempt to escape through the mountain passes or establish a more humane system of survival until rescue arrived. But discovered was their planning by Brenner's network of informants, men who had become so psychologically dependent on the cannibalistic system that they viewed any threat to it as a threat to their own survival. Swift and brutal was the confrontation, occurring during the pre-dawn hours when most of the camp was asleep and unable to witness or interfere with the violence. In a coordinated attack on Donnelly's hiding place was led by Quinlan, a group of loyalists, claiming later that the rebels had attacked first and forced them to defend themselves in what appeared to be a desperate fight for survival. With the methodical efficiency of a military operation ended the violence when Donnelly and 4 of his allies were dead, their bodies bearing injuries that clearly indicated deliberate execution rather than combat wounds. A choice that perfectly illustrated the moral bankruptcy of their situation was given to the remaining rebels: join the inner circle as full participants in the killing and cannibalism, or be processed themselves as the next meal. Integration was chosen by 7 of the 8 surviving rebels, abandoning any pretense of moral resistance in favor of guaranteed survival that required them to participate actively in selecting and killing their former companions. Only one man, Kazimierz Kowalski, refused to participate directly in the murders, though he continued to consume the human flesh that sustained the camp through his detailed documentation of events, creating a compromised position that made him invaluable as a chronicler while keeping him barely alive. The most comprehensive account of Camp 17's descent into systematic cannibalism is provided by Kowalski's detailed diary, discovered decades later in the effects of his grandson, and reveals the psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary men to become enthusiastic participants in ritualized murder. A community where the normal boundaries between civilization and savagery had been completely erased, replaced by a new social order based entirely on the efficient production and consumption of human flesh, is described by his entries. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Camp 17 intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of survival and savagery in the Utah wilderness. What they called the roster, a formal schedule of victims that extended through the remainder of the winter, organized with the same attention to detail that Hartwell had once applied to railroad construction schedules, was how the Inner Circle's complete control over Camp 17 was cemented by the establishment. According to their usefulness, social connections, and perceived loyalty to the new order, workers were ranked, creating a hierarchy where everyone knew their approximate position on the list of future meals. Perhaps days or weeks to live was known by those at the bottom of the roster, while the privilege of participating in the selection of future victims and helping to maintain the system that kept them temporarily safe was enjoyed by those at the top. Devastating was the psychological effect, as men who had once been friends and colleagues now viewed each other primarily in terms of their relative position on the death list and their potential value as food sources. Not just in the systematic nature of the killings, but in the elaborate infrastructure that had been created to support and conceal the cannibalistic operation, became apparent the true horror of Camp 17. By mid-February, into a sophisticated processing facility that rivaled professional slaughterhouses in its efficiency and organization had been transformed Brenner's cook tent, complete with specialized tools for different aspects of human butchery and preservation techniques that ensured maximum utilization of each victim. A complex system for categorizing human meat based on the victim's age, physical condition, and cause of death had been developed by the cook, with different preparation methods applied to optimize both nutritional value and palatability. More tender meat that required minimal seasoning was provided by younger victims, while tougher flesh that benefited from slow cooking methods and careful spicing to mask any undesirable flavors or textures was yielded by older workers. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that systematic experiments in human nutrition had been being conducted by Brenner, testing theories about which organs provided the greatest energy, which preparation methods preserved the most vitamins, and even whether consuming specific body parts might confer psychological or physical benefits to the cannibals. A scientific approach to anthropophagy that transformed murder into research and elevated cannibalism to the level of a medical discipline is revealed by his notes. Wildlife that normally avoided human settlements had been attracted by the camp's transformation, with wolves and bears drawn by the constant smell of cooking meat and the disposal of unusable body parts in remote areas of the valley. Larger and more aggressive scavengers than usual were reported to be seen by workers, suggesting that the ecosystem itself had been altered by the camp's activities and that evidence of their crimes might persist long after the winter ended. Meanwhile, communication protocols with railroad company officials that involved systematic deception about the camp's actual condition and population had been established by Samuel Hartwell. Fictional progress on construction projects were reported by his telegrams, claimed that missing workers had deserted for better opportunities elsewhere, and described weather conditions and supply needs that bore little resemblance to reality. A deliberate effort to prevent any rescue attempts or investigations that might expose what was happening in the mountain camp is suggested by the correspondence. More sinister still were indications that some company officials suspected the truth about Camp 17 but chose to ignore it rather than face the financial and legal consequences of acknowledging systematic murder and cannibalism among their workforce. References to alternative resource management and creative problem-solving under adverse conditions in corporate correspondence suggest that executives were willing to overlook atrocities as long as they didn't become public knowledge or interfere with the railroad's expansion schedule. Beyond simple fear of death extended the psychological control exerted by the Inner Circle to include sophisticated manipulation of group dynamics and individual psychology. A system of rewards and privileges that encouraged workers to compete for favor with their cannibalistic leaders had been implemented by Hartwell, creating incentives for betrayal and collaboration that ensured the survival of their system even among workers who might otherwise resist. Better sleeping quarters, larger food portions, and protection from selection for future meals were given to workers who demonstrated enthusiasm for the new order, while increasingly isolated and vulnerable found themselves those who showed reluctance or moral qualms. Powerful psychological pressure to not just tolerate cannibalism, but to embrace it as a necessary and even beneficial adaptation to their circumstances, was created by the system. On March 3, 1868, when the long-awaited supply train finally appeared on the horizon, struggling through the mountain passes with provisions that could have saved dozens of lives if delivered months earlier, began the final collapse of any pretense of civilization at Camp 17. Cause for celebration among the survivors should have been the sight of the approaching locomotive. but instead, a crisis within the camp's leadership that would ultimately reveal the full extent of their moral disintegration, and the impossibility of concealing their winter activities from outside observers was created by it. An emergency meeting of the inner circle to address what he termed the supply problem was called by Samuel Hartwell, recognizing that the arrival of railroad officials and fresh supplies would make their carefully constructed deception impossible to maintain. To anyone with basic observational skills and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about the camp's dramatically reduced population would be immediately apparent the evidence of their winter activities with outside observers about to arrive. With the efficiency of a commercial meat processing facility was filled the cook tent with preserved human flesh. Through systematic murder had been reduced the camp's population from 127 to fewer than 40 survivors, and the psychological scars of months spent in a cannibalistic hell that had transformed them into something barely recognizable as human beings were borne by many of the remaining workers. Enough to expose their crimes would be the physical evidence alone, but details that could result in mass executions for murder and cannibalism would be provided by the testimony of traumatized survivors. Characteristically brutal and efficient was the solution proposed by Wilhelm Brenner, reflecting the same ruthless pragmatism that had guided his approach to human butchery throughout the winter months. "We eliminate all potential witnesses before the supply train arrives," he suggested with chilling matter-of-factness, then claimed that the missing workers deserted or died from natural causes during the harsh winter months that tested everyone's endurance. "Mountain winters are unforgiving and claim many lives," Brenner continued, his pale eyes reflecting the calculating intelligence that had made him so effective at organizing systematic murder. "No one will question a high casualty rate in such dangerous and isolated conditions, especially if the survivors present a unified account of events that emphasizes natural disasters and unfortunate accidents rather than deliberate violence." The elimination of approximately 30 additional workers in less than 24 hours was required by the plan, a massacre that would dwarf anything they had attempted previously and require coordination and ruthlessness that would test even their hardened commitment to survival through murder. But the only rational choice for men who had already abandoned every moral principle that might have guided their decision-making seemed like mass murder, with the alternative being exposure, trial, and certain execution for their crimes. That the success of Brenner's plan would require the active participation of every member of the inner circle, creating collective guilt that would ensure everyone's silence and commitment to maintaining their fictional account of events, was recognized by Hartwell. "We're all in this together now," he announced to his assembled followers. "Either we all survive by eliminating the evidence, or we all hang together for what we've done during this winter." At dawn on March 5, just hours before the supply train was scheduled to reach Camp 17, began the massacre, with the inner circle moving through the camp systematically and killing sleeping workers in their bunks with hammers, axes, and whatever weapons they could gather. No warning and little opportunity to resist had the victims, having been weakened by months of malnutrition and psychological trauma that had left them defenseless against their former companions who had maintained their strength through human flesh. A horrifying account of those final hours that reads like a descent into hell, orchestrated by men who had completely abandoned their humanity, is provided by Kazimierz Kowalski's diary. "The screaming started just after sunrise, echoing off the mountain walls like the cries of the damned. I heard Brenner's voice shouting orders, telling his men to clean up efficiently and leave no witnesses who might compromise our story. From my hiding place behind the supply shed, I watched them drag bodies to the cook fires, working with the same methodical precision they had used all winter. But this time, they weren't preparing food. They were destroying evidence of the most systematic campaign of murder I have ever witnessed. To burn everything that could implicate them in deliberate murder and cannibalism, then present themselves as the heroic survivors of a winter that had claimed the lives of their less fortunate companions through a combination of accidents, disease, desertion, and the harsh natural conditions that characterized mountain railroad construction, was the plan. But logistical problems that even Brenner's organizational skills couldn't solve in the limited time available had been created by the systematic nature of their crimes. Too great to eliminate completely in the hours available before the supply train's arrival was the sheer volume of human remains, both processed and unprocessed, and difficult to explain to investigators who possessed any level of forensic knowledge would be the physical evidence of their processing facility. Additionally, unlikely that they could maintain consistent stories under questioning by experienced railroad detectives who were trained to identify deception and inconsistency was made by the psychological condition of the surviving workers. As the supply train's whistle echoed through the valley, announcing its imminent arrival and the end of their isolation, a desperate decision that would ultimately doom them all rather than provide the salvation they sought was made by the inner circle. Rather than risk exposure of their cannibalistic activities, they would claim that the camp had been attacked by hostile Indians, with the missing workers killed in the fighting and their bodies carried off by the attackers in accordance with tribal customs that would explain the absence of remains. The dramatically reduced population would be accounted for by this explanation while deflecting suspicion about cannibalism, and it fit with contemporary assumptions about Indian warfare that would make it believable to railroad officials who were already predisposed to blame Native Americans for problems encountered during westward expansion. The survivors' traumatized condition and their reluctance to discuss details of their ordeal would also be justified by the story. Huddled in the supply shed were found 18 survivors by the arriving railroad officials, carefully coordinated to support the Indian attack narrative that would supposedly explain the disappearance of 109 workers during the brutal mountain winter were their stories. A compelling account of siege conditions and heroic resistance that initially satisfied the investigators, who were more concerned with resuming construction than conducting thorough forensic analysis, was delivered by Samuel Hartwell, his military bearing intact despite months of cannibalistic brutality. Hastily cleaned and reorganized to conceal evidence of human processing was Wilhelm Brenner's cook tent, with the abundance of preserved meat explained as successful hunting and careful rationing during the winter months, displaying the same professional competence that had made him valuable to the railroad company before his descent into systematic cannibalism. Credible to officials who had no reason to suspect the truth about their survival methods was made his explanation by his calm demeanor and detailed knowledge of food preservation techniques. But more thorough than the survivors had anticipated were the investigators, particularly Company Detective Harrison Vale, a former Union Army intelligence officer whose experience with military investigations had taught him to recognize inconsistencies and deception even among traumatized witnesses. Discrepancies in the survivors' stories were noted by Vale, and separate interviews with individual workers began to be conducted by him, applying psychological pressure that revealed cracks in their carefully rehearsed narrative. Fragments of the truth were broken down and revealed by several members of the outer circle under persistent questioning, describing the systematic murders and cannibalism that had sustained the camp through the winter months. A picture of horror that went far beyond anything the investigators had imagined possible, transforming what had appeared to be a tragic but understandable survival story into evidence of the most systematic campaign of murder and cannibalism in American frontier history, was painted by their testimonies. The final piece of evidence that would condemn the Camp 17 survivors and expose the full scope of their crimes was provided by the discovery of Kowalski's hidden diary. A picture of premeditated murder and cannibalism so systematic that it challenged everything the railroad company thought they knew about frontier survival and human nature under extreme conditions was painted by his detailed documentation of the killing schedule, victim selection process, and the inner circle's planning sessions. Within 2 weeks of the supply train's arrival was completed the official investigation into Camp 17, but the true priorities of America's industrial expansion during the post-Civil War era are revealed by the railroad company's response. Rather than pursuing criminal prosecution for what was clearly systematic murder and cannibalism involving over 100 victims, all evidence of the incident was chosen to be suppressed by Union Pacific executives, fearing that public knowledge of the events would damage their reputation and interfere with ongoing government subsidies that were essential to the company's financial survival. To different work sites across the Western Territories were quietly transferred the 18 survivors, with strict confidentiality agreements that prohibited them from discussing their experiences at Camp 17 under penalty of criminal prosecution for violation of company secrets. To a comfortable desk job in Omaha, where company officials could monitor his activities and ensure his continued silence about events that could destroy the railroad's public image and federal support, was promoted Samuel Hartwell. Entirely from railroad records within weeks of the investigation's conclusion disappeared Thomas Quinlan, though some evidence suggests he was provided with substantial funds to establish a new identity in California, where he could live comfortably without the risk of revealing company secrets. Unknown remains Wilhelm Brenner's fate, but shipping records indicate that a man matching his description and carrying substantial cash booked passage to South America shortly after the investigation concluded, suggesting that the company facilitated his escape to ensure his permanent silence. standardized letters claiming their loved ones had died in weather-related accidents and Indian attacks during the harsh mountain winter were given to the families of the missing 109 workers, with small compensation payments intended to discourage further investigation into circumstances that the company claimed were classified for national security reasons. All records related to Camp 17, including personnel files, supply manifests, and telegraph communications that might have revealed the systematic abandonment of the work crew and the company's knowledge of subsequent events, were systematically destroyed by company officials. What was officially described as a complete nervous breakdown following his cooperation with the investigation was suffered by Kazimierz Kowalski, whose diary had provided crucial evidence of the crimes and whose testimony had exposed the systematic nature of the cannibalistic murders. To an asylum in Chicago was he committed, where he died 3 years later under circumstances that remain suspicious and which some evidence suggests involved deliberate poisoning to ensure his permanent silence. However, secretly copied by Detective Harrison Vale had been his diary, who retained the documents as insurance against potential company retaliation and as evidence of corporate crimes that might someday be prosecuted if political conditions changed. The most comprehensive account of Camp 17's transformation from a railroad construction site into a systematic cannibalistic operation that rivaled the worst atrocities in human history is provided by Vale's copy of the diary, discovered after his death in 1889. With characteristic industrial efficiency that demonstrated the railroad company's determination to erase every trace of events that could threaten their financial interests was eliminated the physical evidence of Camp 17's horrors. As geologically unstable was officially designated the work site and abandoned, with all equipment and structures removed or destroyed through controlled explosions that eliminated any potential archaeological evidence of the winter's activities. By 1870, no trace remained of the camp where 109 workers had died to feed their companions through one of the most brutal winters in Utah's recorded history, and from official railroad maps and survey records had been removed the location to prevent future investigation by historians or curiosity seekers who might ask uncomfortable questions about the missing construction crew. However, impossible to suppress entirely proved the psychological impact on the survivors, despite the company's best efforts to monitor and control their activities. Publicly about their experiences spoke several former Camp 17 workers over the following decades, breaking their confidentiality agreements, though their accounts were generally dismissed as the ravings of men traumatized by frontier hardships and Indian warfare rather than credible testimony about systematic cannibalism. That the railroad company took active measures to prevent further revelations about the cannibalistic winter of 1867-68 is suggested by the pattern of unexplained deaths and disappearances among the survivors during the years following their release, using methods that ranged from financial incentives to more permanent solutions for workers who proved unwilling to maintain their silence about company secrets. Unmarked and unremembered remained the location of Camp 17 until 1923, when references to the site in archived Union Pacific correspondence that had escaped the company's systematic destruction of evidence were uncovered by railroad historian Margaret Hensley. The scope of the cover-up and the systematic nature of the crimes were revealed by her investigation. But blocked by legal challenges from the railroad company's successors were her attempts to publish her findings, who claimed that disclosure would violate trade secrets and compromise national security. The most comprehensive account of how industrial ambition and corporate callousness created the conditions for one of America's most horrific episodes of survival cannibalism, and how systematic cover-ups protected the perpetrators while denying justice to the families of over 100 murder victims, is provided by Hensley's research files, discovered after her death in 1954. Today, beneath the waters of a federal reservoir created by dam construction in the 1960s lies the site of Camp 17, ensuring that any remaining physical evidence of the winter's atrocities will remain permanently inaccessible to investigators or historians. Through the Utah mountains continue to carry freight the railroad tracks that were built with such human cost, though few passengers are aware that they're traveling over what was once a landscape of systematic murder and cannibalism that challenged the basic assumptions of civilized society. Never acknowledged the events at Camp 17, or offered any recognition to the families of the workers who died there, as the Union Pacific Railroad, now one of North America's largest transportation companies with billions in annual revenue, maintaining the same policy of denial and suppression that protected the company's interests during the original cover-up over a century ago. That the most horrifying monsters are not supernatural creatures lurking in dark forests, but ordinary people pushed beyond the boundaries of human decency by desperation, isolation,